Well, good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm Josh Schimmels, publisher and CEO of the Los Angeles Business Journal. It's great to be here hosting today's discussion on the new flexible hybrid workplace, a roadmap for employers, which is presented by our friends at Michelman and Robinson. Today, you're going to hear from the experts as they discuss remote work, what employers with off-site employees should try to keep top of mind in order to optimize workplace efficiencies, productivity, and of course, the all-important connectivity amongst each other. Our topics today are going to include the home office. How did we actually get here? We're going to look at COVID-19 as an imperfect testing ground for the work from home movement. We're going to talk about the importance of engagement, fostering integrated, collaborative, and cohesive teams, which, as we know, has been so difficult and so challenging to do the right way over the last couple of years. And then we're going to look at legal considerations, wage and hour law, workplace bias, and the like. I want to thank those of you who already submitted questions to us during the registration process. We were able to integrate many of them into the conversations and topics that we're going to be talking about today. And then others we're going to try to address at the end, bearing we have time. All right, so we've got a lot of really great content to get to. So I'd like to get started. Please help me welcome and introduce today's speakers. First, we have Laura Shorts, firm recruiting partner. Laura leads the Labor and Employment Practice Group at M&R and is the firm's Employment Advice Council and Executive Disputes Chair. Operating out of the Los Angeles office, Laura is also the firm recruiting partner, which means she's tasked with implementing M&R's strategic plan, which is to expand upon its roster of talented attorneys nationwide. I also want to point out that in our very own Los Angeles Business Journal, she was recognized last month as one of our most influential women attorneys in Los Angeles. It's an honor bestowed upon her multiple times now. And also, I'd like to introduce Dana Kravitz. Dana is Michelman and Robinson's firm managing partner. In that capacity, he oversees the firm's 7 different offices across 4 states, California, Texas, Illinois, New York. He's responsible and is a hospitality industry authority and an employment law specialist who represents some of the most admired and some of the most innovative companies in both Los Angeles and beyond. Of note, the Daily Journal recently designated Dana as a top labor and employment lawyer, and the Los Angeles Business Journal has named him a Leader in Law nominee for 3 consecutive years. Dana and Laura, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We've had a lot of great conversations leading up to this in order to discover and come up with topics that we think are going to be invaluable to employees and employers alike. Welcome. I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Josh, thanks so much for having us. We at Michelman and Robinson are very happy to participate and look forward to these opportunities. So thank you for having us, and thank you to the LA Business Journal. As Josh said, we're going to cover a number of topics today that surround work from home and the hybrid workplace. Laura and I were preparing for today and sort of jokingly said that we're both actually presenting today from the office. So despite the hybrid work and despite the move towards work from home, we decided to actually come to work today and present from here. So, the first topic that we wanted to cover is sort of the how did we get here? We've looked at this topic a lot over the last several years, as you can imagine. And some of the key factors that we focused on is looking at the technological change, right? The advent of really Zoom coming into play, Teams, the ability to really connect remotely has lent itself to a work from home environment. You've also got sort of competing with that, the increasing expectation among employees of their own well-being. And that's been something that's gotten a lot of press, a lot of coverage, and the idea that the employees are vocal about how they want to spend their work life and doing that with a component of it at home is certainly something that the employers are taking note of. And you sort of couple those two things, technology, the well-being, and sort of put it into a work-life balance concept where people want more balance in their life and their personal life. And that sort of creates the driving forces that have sort of gotten us to this place. And really, work from home is no longer about where you work. really the outcome of the work, right? It's not about where you're doing your time, but really, but really how you're performing. And so, we've again focused on the technology, and then there's the efficiencies. Where the fact of the matter is, with COVID, travel was difficult, if not impossible. People were at home, and so companies took on the video conferencing pretty readily and figured out a way to use the technology to their advantage, and that obviously led to more face-to-face meetings, albeit virtually. And then you have some of the sort of late arrivers. You've got the companies and the government in particular that was sort of late to the party in terms of, slowly adopting to the concept of work from home. But as those companies and as the government took that on, that also led to more work from home being more readily acceptable. And that's kind of where we are today. Laura?
Yeah, I just wanted to address your point about well-being. I think in today's world, what we're seeing with social movements such as the Me Too movement and BLM movement affecting the workplace and the conversations in the workplace, I think we have to be more thoughtful about our workplace environment generally. And we've seen, multiple studies that confirm that work from home is valued, in particular by diverse workers. So this would include, everything from women workers. There's a lot of discussion about how work from home is particularly helpful for women and mothers. I think that does come out of COVID to a certain extent with the, school closures and everything we saw with that. But also, employees that have physical or mental health disabilities and, physical disabilities, an obvious one, and also some of the other disabilities we're seeing that were largely impacted during COVID. There have been a lot of studies about microaggressions in the workplace, and that, folks who feel the ability to work from home feel that it's much more comfortable for them. And then, there are things that I think aren't talked about as much, but things like location bias. So we talk about, economic diversity in the workplace and how that impacts, the workforce, who's getting impacted, having to drive, significant distances every day. Things like super commuters who are spending more than 90 plus hours on the road every day, and the efficiencies that come with work from home just in people's own personal lives, and the ability to spend more time at home, or frankly, even more time working than necessarily on the road. So, I think this allows employers to have a broader sector of employees to choose from. Of course, during COVID, a lot of folks moved out of state even, which I'm sure we'll talk about the whole host of legal issues that raises. But, also many businesses are making a very active push to have a more diverse workforce. So in terms of retention, things we can do to increase employee retention, particularly right now, which is, we're in a market where really the employees are dictating the market conditions to a large extent. But, a number of positives that we've talked about that, work from home contributes to, including the cost savings, simple things like gas. Well, I guess it's not that simple right now, but gas, clothing, meals, the time savings that I just talked about, and the stress that, comes from the commute. There are certain areas of industries, particularly within the creative industry, where, folks have talked about the ability to have their own custom home office environment, and that contributes greatly to their satisfaction at work. And of course, fewer interruptions. I think the day-to-day interruptions can be lessened to a certain degree with the work from home environment. So, I think there's a number of things we've spoken about with respect to, costs and savings across the board. I think those affect the employers as well.
I think also, you've got the situation. It's also good for the employer to a certain extent, right? There's the lowering of the cost and the overhead in the long run by having a component of your workforce at home during any given week. And so that can lower rents. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but there's obviously good considerations for the employer as well. The big one that we focused on, I mentioned at the beginning, is the concept of work-life balance, which is really your work life and your personal life and this drive towards maintaining balance. And, Laura and I kind of looked at the word of work-life balance and focusing more on the work life. Your actual work life also is finding a balance. That work life is not only time in the office, but time at home, which gives people the ability to work independently, gives people the time to work on an individualized basis, gives them a lot of autonomy, gives them time to really think and be creative. And so there's also that work life in and of itself that has required a balance. And to a certain extent, what we're seeing in driving towards a work from home and a hybrid workplace is a lower stress level, a lower burnout factor. And those things, certainly are important in terms of the overall well-being of your workforce. Yeah.
And I think, we would be remiss not to talk about sort of what we've seen with the Great Resignation. As I mentioned earlier, that we are seeing a lot of the market conditions being driven by employees. And so we're seeing a bigger emphasis from our employee workforce on prioritizing time at home. Most of us spent a lot more time with our families at home during COVID, which I think caused a lot of folks to rethink their work-life situation and their work-life balance and reprioritize what that looks like.
Yeah, and I think also, the issue that we look at from an employer perspective is employee retention. Obviously, it's a big issue to be having to retain employees, to not have to hire new, retrain. Those are very expensive propositions. And in that, the employers have really had to adapt very quickly in this changing landscape. And it's been a fair amount of pressure on our employer clients, on our own firm for that matter, trying to stay ahead of the curve, trying to sort of evolve in real time, all towards an attempt to retain our employees. And ultimately, what we kind of focused on and where we think that the key ingredient in all that is the development of the loyalty between employer and employee. The retention is going to be there if there's a loyalty factor. And that loyalty factor is really driven by an acknowledgement by the employer of the employee's importance, of their need for that work-life balance, generally, that need for a balance within their own work, to be at home and to be in the office or in a corporate environment or business environment. And if you can start to emphasize those culturally, then that loyalty will be bred, and that will certainly help with regard to retention. As we sort of move through today, as Josh said, we're really kind of focused on the how do we get here, which we've covered. And then we want to focus a fair amount on the risks associated with having a work from home or hybrid environment, and also talk about what works in that environment and how we can increase on the engagement side. And then we'll roll into legal considerations. We can't, as lawyers, avoid getting into that. So, I think what we know about kind of work from home generally is that COVID is really a catalyst to what may have been something that was ultimately going to occur anyway. So I don't view necessarily the movement towards work from home or a hybrid workplace as really a manifestation of COVID in of itself, but really just COVID serving as a catalyst. And the issues that we saw is that COVID arrived and there was really no opportunity for a lot of planning. Companies were really flying by the seat of their pants to figure out a way to adapt to having everybody at home and sort of coming out of COVID, hopefully, and being in a position where it's still relevant in our work lives, but not as prevalent as it's been. You can't necessarily operate your company in the same way you did in COVID. In COVID, it's sort of an artificial landscape, right? Everyone's at home. The world outside is relatively not moving. But that's not the case now. So to the extent you have people who are going to be working from home on a hybrid schedule, the acknowledgement, of course, is that the world has changed and it is active again. And so whatever you've adopted in terms of your modeling during COVID isn't necessarily going to translate to where we are today. And we have to be mindful of that. Now, statistically, we've looked at some of the polls, some of the Gallup polls, and we've seen that really 9 out of 10, 90% of all workers do want some form of work from home, which is a sort of a staggering number. You've got the vast majority, 90% of all employees want that. 60% of all employees want a hybrid approach, which, allows us to recognize that as much as people are stressing working from home, there's an acknowledgement that the hybrid still is something that employees are comfortable with. They want the ability still to come into work as much as they also want to be at home. But we're very mindful of the fact that you've got this overwhelming majority of the employees that want some form of hybrid and work from home landscape.
Yes, and I think as we emerge out of COVID, what we're seeing is a number of businesses. I mean, I think the vast majority of our clients are adopting a hybrid model. And it's frankly working with varying degrees of success. So, in certain industries, take, for example, the hospitality industry, it's very difficult or, in a lot of instances, impossible to work from home. So, you're seeing a push from employees that could potentially work from home. Some of the more managerial positions sort of requesting that hybrid model, but really challenging to adopt in a business where, the vast majority of the workforce has to be at the workplace. So, I think that what we're seeing is, the movement towards hybrid or work from home is largely driven by industry and even demographics. I also don't think we keep talking about emerging out of COVID, but, we're seeing cases rise again, and we're seeing the impact of this on businesses. There are still, we're here in LA and California, there's still Cal OSHA regulations that have to be adhered to. And this is becoming a major issue for a lot of employers who are trying to implement a return to work policy, particularly those who have been sort of on the slower end of return to work. I think the most obvious example of this, I'm sure everybody's been seeing in the news, is, Apple's tried to roll out a return to work, plan, which has been highly publicized because there's been a ton of, pushback from Apple employees. This was literally to roll out a hybrid schedule. It wasn't a full return to work, but they, recently had a very senior engineer resigning over the return to work ask and citing safety concerns due to the rising COVID cases. So you're seeing, companies like Apple literally changing their return to work plans that have been in the works for, many months, sort of having to step back on the plan. But I do think this is largely industry based. We're seeing this, to be a much bigger issue with our tech clients, in the tech and gaming spaces, those industries that really were, I think, had more work from home previously, and, also a demographic issue, I think, as well. But we're seeing a lot of those types of clients having multiple resignations or even, terminations due to, return to work requirements. So refusal to return to the office, leading to those things. And I would say, for the more traditional businesses and sort of service oriented businesses, we're seeing this to be more isolated on a case by case basis. So just out of the gate, what we're seeing is even the way we structure return to work can give rise to, certain issues in the workplace.
And so I think where we want to focus for the balance of this segment is assuming that you're going to adopt a work from home or hybrid model within your company, acknowledging that there's going to be risks as much as we'll get to what are the positives and we've touched on some of the positives, but as much as there are positives, we should focus on what some of those risks are so you can see how they play out. There's a fairly staggering statistic that's been floating around with regard to those who are working from home, which is saying that 40% of all people working from home are also holding a second job. The idea that you could be employing somebody with the belief that they are full-time devoted to you, I think would be naive in the face of this statistic. You have 40% of the people that are holding a second type of job in some fashion, not necessarily full-time, but another type of job. And it goes to the place that it's very difficult to know what, as an employer, what your employees are doing when they are at home. So I think that that's something to be mindful of and come up with different ways to cut against that in terms of a reaffirmation by your employees that they're not moonlighting and that they're devoted full-time to you, and certainly not working for competing businesses. But that's a very real issue. Another one of the risks that we focus on is productivity. There's this sort of notion that there's a decline in productivity, and that could be of concern. And a lot of times what we hear back from employees is, I can't believe how productive I am actually at home. I think to a certain extent, people during COVID were saying, I'm so productive at home, but what they were really saying is, I'm so surprised about how productive I am at home, as opposed to that they're in fact so productive. And that's, in a world that's basically on a standstill, you could believe that you're pretty productive having not been at home that duration and that significantly and still doing work. But now, as we're sort of rolling out of COVID, there's a concern on the part of employers that there's a relative decline in productivity. And so what we tend to focus with respect to the advice we give to clients is not to be so concerned about the hours logged, which is certainly, sort of a traditional way of assessing someone's busyness level, but focus more on the outcomes and more on the productivity and the outcome of their job, so that you can actually see both on an individual and team level how they're performing. And then also coming up with very tailored metrics that are measurable, so that you can actually mark someone's performance, as opposed to simply looking at timesheets to suggest they're doing their job. Another risk that we see that is concerning is the flip side of what is some of the positives, but it is the notion of disengagement. 60% of all employees say that they feel a little less connected to their culture of the company and to their coworker. That's probably pretty understandable given the fact that they are working from home. But it's a big number in terms of 60% feeling that disconnection and disengagement. And so certainly video and using Teams and using Zoom is a way to cut against that, to give more face time and connectivity, but it doesn't necessarily replace the in-person. It also, of course, requires a pretty heavy lift on the part of the employer to make sure people have the proper technology, Wi-Fi, what have you, so that they could actually engage on those platforms. So that's another piece. Another risk that we see a lot has to do with the ergonomics. We certainly have grown accustomed in the workplace to having our workers' comp carriers come out and do ergonomic analysis, or a consultant come in and look at how those are playing out. But we haven't necessarily gone into everyone's home. But if that is their workplace, there's an obligation on the employer to be concerned about how that's playing out from an ergonomic perspective. And that's sort of a new thing that employers are grappling with, because there's a huge price tag associated with that if you're going to every employer's home or employee's home to see what their setup is. Another one of the risks is that there's this sort of push from employees to work from home when the job doesn't necessarily neatly fit into a work from home or hybrid environment. And yet the concern is, if you push back as an employer, that you could suffer in terms of that employee leaving. And so there's a relaxation from the employer to allow more work from home than necessarily is good for the company, or really being responsive to what the position entails. But the employee is pressing hard on that. And so just be mindful that you can't be everything to everybody. And if the answer is the job is more susceptible to being office bound, then that's what the role is. And then another thing that has been challenging involves distractions. And we actually got a comment that came in, or a question involving work from home, which is the positive impact of children seeing parents working in real time, being at home and seeing their parents doing their job. And is that a positive? And certainly one would say, getting that sort of real time visual of your parent putting in good work would be beneficial for the child to see that. I can understand that. One of the other issues that we see in terms of risk associated with work from home is the distraction of having your kids at home, which I think we all sort of recognized in the COVID setting where everybody was home. But now that we're coming out of that, people are still, sort of saying, hey, I can cut costs by getting rid of my childcare, third-party childcare. And what I can really do is take care of that, of my child while I'm at work. And so, yes, there's a positive, undoubtedly, seeing your parents working hard, but it could certainly be a distraction to the to the parent and to the worker, which the employer must be mindful of, and the employee as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably varies pretty significantly in terms of, what kind of the nature of the job, and whether you want your kids, to be seeing you, working on a day-to-day basis, particularly, in our field, which can be rather adversarial at times. But I guess it is what it is. But I think, you're right. During COVID, with the distractions, everybody was at home. And so it was, and everybody was primarily sort of locked down and at home. And so things like, accessibility, getting in touch with folks was much easier than what we're seeing now, which is, people are out and about. And so, I think work from home has taken on a different, meaning. But I think in terms of additional challenges, I did want to address some of the things that might not be sort of top of mind for folks, but are really important, are things like accessibility from the viewpoint of, Zoom and Teams and the things we've sort of adopted in terms of the technology that we think is so great. And, for a lot of reasons it is, like we're here now and can do this, fairly easily. But it can be challenging for both, older and disabled workers. So, some of the things that we've been talking about that I haven't really, we're not really seeing implemented on a large scale are things like having, closed captions on screens, larger font sizes, high contrast images, things that make, the Zoom, Teams sort of video environment a lot easier for folks that do have, challenges with respect to, vision impairment, hearing impairment, which can be very challenging in a work from home environment. We're also seeing, a significant increase in, ADA, workers' comp claims, often relating to COVID exposures, or complaints about, the safety in the workplace environment. That was one of the things that I had cited earlier with respect to the Apple return to work. And so, all of that are, issues that have been coming up and risks relating to, hybrid return to work, as well as some of the real issues that we're seeing with, a purely work from home model or a hybrid model where we do have still a significant part of the workforce working from home. One of the things I know we did get questions about, and one of the things that comes up with our clients all of the time is the issue of favoritism. So, what do I do when I have someone productive that's working from home, and then I have someone who, may not be as much of a high achiever that's also working from home, and I can get the work product I need out of the, high achiever from home and not out of the other employee. So, I guess the question, Dana, is, can I allow the more productive worker to work from home and require the other one to, come back to the office?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna cover a little bit of that when we get into the legal, in terms of sort of the possibility of discrimination as a purely legal issue. But I'll talk more generally about favoritism because it tends to be an issue that sort of swirls around legal, right? If there's the perception of favoritism or actual favoritism that's going on in the workplace, then an employee is going to look to their own potential characteristic and claim that's the basis for the different treatment. The advice we're giving our clients out of the gate is that there has to be clear, concise communication of what your expectations are as an employer in terms of work from home. Who's getting it? Who isn't? What positions mandate it? Which don't? Where you need people on site full time? Where you don't? And if you can lay that out sort of at the outset with a lot of clarity, then you're managing the expectation of the employee. It's those employers that are, not very clear coming out of COVID with what their plan is going to be that I think are most susceptible to an ultimate claim and certainly claims of favoritism. One of the issues that I'm pretty starkly aware of is that rolling out a hybrid workplace model, the buy-in at the management level is what I'm seeing is the most problematic, because you have a lot of people in management roles that are still, saying, hey, my company's doing this, but the reality is I want my team in at work. We're more productive when we're here. I'm always here. You should be here too. So think about that. How effective is a work from home going to be readily adopted across the board when you have pockets of managers who are intimating or being, overt with their team saying, I'd love to see you here. I'm here. You should be here too. I think that that's pretty difficult for a lot of managers to actually come to the place of saying, hey, we're on a 3-2, 3 in the office, 2 at home. I'm going to be at home 2 days as well. What we're seeing, our managers saying, yeah, you guys can be at home 2 days. That's fine. I'm going to be here every day. And what we ultimately have are certain employees that would think that they're going to be better served in terms of career advancement if they slowly trickle back into work. And so my manager's there. I think I should be there too. So, all of a sudden the team largely is working because the manager said, I'm here every day. Now, if the team is now working in the office, then you've created, a different categories within one company. And you could have people within one business unit saying, hey, I'm not working in the office 5 days a week. You said it was 3-2. I've laid out my work-life balance. I pick up my kids, from school on these 2 days, and I've, got a life outside of work. And so I'm not going to come in. And then it could lend itself to a breeding ground of favoritism and perceived advantage. And that's where claims would come from. So I will touch on it a little bit more, but that's certainly an issue that we're seeing in terms of how management is implementing the policy across the board. So I would be very clear with our managers, and we do it here, that if we're going to adopt a hybrid, it has to be accepted by everybody, and it has to be adhered to by everybody, or you're going to create differences within one workplace. And one of the other issues that we see in terms of risk has to do with confidential information. There's more controls that are necessarily in place on site than there would be at home. There's other people that are in your home. There's other people that could see documentation. There's questions about privacy. There's questions about how locked down your system is in terms of being susceptible to any sort of cyber attack. You could have roommates. You could have other people seeing information. And so there's a lot that swirls around confidential information. And you have to, as an employer, have controls in place that allow the employee to know what they can and cannot share, what they can and cannot take home, how they access the system. Do they work on their own device? Do they work on a company device? Do they use their own email? Do they use company email? All the things that you would naturally think are taken care of already in the workplace. But when they're at home, there's a tendency for employees to sort of relax the rules. And that is going to be lending itself to breaches of confidential information and privileged information. And that obviously can't be tolerated by the business. So that has to be addressed at the outset when you're rolling out your plan. That covers a lot of the risks that we see. There are a lot of positives in terms of the hybrid workplace. We do want to shift into the importance of the engagement and fostering the interactive and collaborative team environment. When we talk about implementing hybrid in terms of what happens, there is a recognition that you should start looking at how a person conducts himself in the week and what work is susceptible to being done in the office and what work can be done at home. I'll talk a little bit about our own firm. We started out coming out of COVID on a 4-1, where we were giving Friday as the time where people could work from home, which in hindsight, it worked for the time, but it wasn't going to lend itself to where we are today. And so we've migrated to a 3-2, 3 in the office, 2 at home. Having those 2 dedicated days is really designed so that people can start to manage their workload in terms of what can be done at home on a more individualized basis. And where do you need to come to work to be in a team environment? Where is it more collaborative? When do you need to work in meetings? When do we need to do presentations? When do we need to sort of be side by side? Those are the days that we come to work and the team knows when to come in. And days when you can be more individualized in your work, then those are the days that you would otherwise be at home, where there's less interruption and fewer distractions. And that's really something that takes a bit of a balancing act to see what works. And we talked about at the beginning this notion of breeding loyalty, and part of it is being adaptable as a business to seeing what does work and what sort of integrated and collaborative environment can actually be achieved. Employees sort of have come to this place that the sort of the human need for themselves is the right to work anywhere in the world. That's sort of they come from the place that's a human need that they have, and the employer should adopt to that. A fact that is something that's right in our face is that 1 out of every 2 employees would consider leaving their job if there was no hybrid option. So if you think about that, half your workforce is potentially going to look to go elsewhere if you don't adopt hybrid. That doesn't mean it's here forever. It doesn't mean you have to do it, but know that people would be looking for other opportunity if you don't. So it's the market is what it is at the moment. You saw what Laura talked about with regard to Apple. And if we're focused on retention and we're trying to reduce turnover, then the adoption of a hybrid work environment that's really recognizing what work can be done together when we're in the office and what work can be done at home is something to be mindful of.
Yeah, I mean, Dana, you talked about, shifting from a 4-1 to now we're on a 3-2. And, I just don't think it can be really a one size fits all for every business, or frankly, every situation. I think that, we really have to be thoughtful as organizational leaders in thinking about, when do we need folks in the office? Why do we need them there? Are there situations, where, maybe there's a period of time where we need folks in, more regularly. And so, the notion of the sort of rigidity of a schedule isn't going to work out so well. And we have, maybe a period of time, whether for our business, for example, if we're in trial and everybody needs to be all hands on deck for, several weeks in a row, that may be just the reality of the situation that we have. And so, but I think, when we're talking about implementing a hybrid schedule that works across the board and thinking about, what are the best uses of our time, I think we want to make sure that we maximize, those in-office days. So if you are, having, requiring people to be in the office and that everybody's, sitting in their offices and nobody's interacting with each other, it tends to, I think, breed resentment in terms of all of the things that we just talked about, the commute and the stress and everything else, in coming to the office and not having a productive time. But, there are a lot of positives in terms of teamwork and mentorship and all of, the positive side of being in the office, the connection. And so I think what, is really important is to be very thoughtful about how are we going to maximize those times? Are we scheduling team meetings for those days? What are we doing in terms of, activities that involve engagement and really foster that sort of team mentality that is, we are missing when we're working from home. And how do we make sure that on those days where everybody is together, that we're really maximizing that time? So, one of the examples I wanted to give, are situational circumstances involving the onboarding of new team members. So, a lot of companies operate in a very team heavy environment. I know we do here at the firm. And so, it is really hard for folks to feel integrated when everybody's working from home. So having those touch points, ensuring that they have those, personal touch points on the days where folks are in the office to make sure that you're integrating new folks on the team, I think is really important. The same goes for mentorship. I think a lot of what we see in terms of mentoring, the next generation of our employees is super important to have that, personal touch point in person. We had a whole team of associates that started during COVID, which is very unusual. I think in the beginning, they thought it was great. And when we started coming back to work, at least on a hybrid model, I got a lot of comments from our junior associates that it was so much easier to learn once they were back in the office and they could just sit in on meetings, pop in sort of unexpectedly in terms of particularly for folks who are new to the workplace. So just out of college or just out of, professional school, understanding workflow, office dynamics, or even just having the ability to, connect with folks that aren't necessarily on your team, I think is, those are the types of things that we want to be thinking about. How do we make sure that we're doing those types of things that people really need in terms of career development when they're in the office? Again, it doesn't require folks to be in the office every day, but I don't think, some of these things that we're talking about don't exactly lend themselves to a complete work from home environment either. So, I think, what we're talking about is trying to find that happy medium. How do we get our business needs met, the needs of our employees met, and at the same time give people some of that freedom to have that sort of work-life balance and be able to manage some of the, the upside of work from home. And again, I think this goes back to retention. Happy and engaged employees tend to be harder working and more productive and more loyal. And I think, based on the statistics you cited, Dana, employees still do want in-office experiences, but want to have, some ability to manage their week as well.
Thanks, Laura. Well, you have two lawyers here, so you knew we were going to get to legal issues. And looking at the questions coming in, they're almost all legally related. So I can appreciate as we go into our final segment that this is important to those people that are participating today. The interesting thing, and I'll pose the question to you, Laura, is we're dealing with a body of law federally and certainly within California where laws have been written with factories, offices, retail stores in mind. And the question is, does the law and the body of law that we're dealing with lend itself and fit with work from home?
Yeah, I think the short answer to that is definitely not. I know I definitely can confirm that none of the laws that we have relating to this, to these wage and hour issues and issues that are coming up with work from home were written or contemplated in a time where anyone was thinking about, work from home or hybrid environment. Frankly, I think the vast majority of our employment laws, particularly with respect to wage and hour, really do lend themselves to a factory setting. And so you see, employers really grappling with that even well before COVID. But, there is certainly, and I did see a number of the questions as well relating to expenses. We've got in California, Labor Code 2802, and there are, federal and other state laws that address some of this. I think California is, no surprise, probably one of the more comprehensive states with respect to, our Labor Code 2802 that requires, the necessary, what they call the necessary expenditures incurred in the discharge of, an employee's duties that have to be reimbursed. And so we look at what that means. There is very little case law on this subject. There are just a couple of cases and some, opinions coming out of the Labor Commissioner's office that primarily deal with things like cell phone and internet reimbursement, and it's pre-COVID, but essentially you've got to cover, the reasonable expenditures that folks are making. So even if someone already has, for example, Wi-Fi, they have already paying for internet service at home, and you're requiring them to use it for purposes of doing their job, then you as the employer have an obligation to pay for some of that. So maybe not the whole thing, but some portion of that. And so we've seen literally our clients roll out everything from, just a set amount of expenses that they're going to cover, and it's going to cover, what they think is reasonable. We have, a number of clients that tend to be larger workforces that really try to study and parse out, how much time are folks spending on the phone? How much time are they on the computer? What does their work setup look like? What is really necessary for their job, and figure out, percentages of reimbursement based on, their position. But there is, expense reimbursement is required, but it's, the necessary expenditure. So, if if an employee needs, a stand-up desk, that doesn't mean that they get to go to, Design Within Reach and pick out their stand-up desk that they need. You as the employer have some control over what that looks like. But again, things like ergonomics, I think that internet and phone is the biggest one. If you are texting your employees and you're expecting them to text you back and they're using their phones, then you have to be thinking about the reimbursement of the phone, of the Wi-Fi that's required to use the phone, of the internet that you're requiring, and all of those things. You have to be thinking about how to reimburse those, at least in part. So that is a big issue. We see a lot, depending on, the type of company you have and what is really required. I think that can vary. There's no like set limit or number that you're required to reimburse. But again, the laws on this are older than the situations that we're dealing with. And of course, I just raised the issue of texting. We still have, pretty significant wage and hour considerations relating to non-exempt or hourly employees that are working from home or on a hybrid model. You still have to think about things like overtime, meal and rest breaks, things like using of the phone and how that lends itself, potentially to off the clock work. Some of the issues that we're seeing are the, push and pull between, an employer's expectation, not being able to physically see their employees. So you've got, maybe a manager with an hourly worker that's working from home. They try to reach the hourly worker's on lunch break. They text the hourly worker doesn't respond. Then they, is that a performance issue? They're feeling like, they're not available. You got to have your folks trained. The managers have to be trained to understand that, employees do have their meal and rest breaks available to them. They've got to be able to take those uninterrupted. Otherwise, you're going to start, incurring all of the same things that you do in the workplace, the meal penalties, and everything else that comes along with, violating those laws. Off the clock with respect to work from home is a huge issue. So making sure you have a timekeeping system and the ability for employees to access that. And of course, staying on top of that, because it certainly lends itself to, folks taking advantage of that, because you can't actually see them. You can't see when they're coming and going. And I think a lot of that goes to communication. And I think Dana's going to talk a lot about communication as well. But, having systems in place, whether you're on Teams or Slack or whatever system you're on. So, the folks at home are effectively communicating with the folks that may be in the office or can't see them otherwise, or, are maybe everybody's at home and isn't sure where, how to reach each other. Making sure that folks are communicating and have the ability to, I can tell you here at our office, we have, we work on Teams, and, when our hourly colleagues go out on breaks, they literally put it on the Teams. So we know, it's lunch break now. So that's an uninterrupted, meal break that they're entitled to. And so, I think there's a lot. It's a big hot topic with the work from home and the hybrid. And so that's certainly something we're looking at.
Yeah, I think, just to touch a little bit more on the final point on the wage and hour, because it's vital to understand kind of where we've come from. With the where things were with COVID, and it led to a lot of the employee burnout. There was this sort of expectation of employers that you're always available, and the day sort of got extended, starting really early, going late at night. Like, hey, you're at home, you have nowhere to be, so I should be able to get you at all hours. And that sort of mentality has continued on. And that needs to stop. I mean, quite frankly, there needs to be clear indication and understanding of what the hours are, of what the hours are committed to, and tracking of those hours. So, which gets into issues of monitoring productivity, because there's this sort of overwhelming desire of employers to really, look, I work with a lot of clients, and sort of out of the gate, it's no one's working from home. Nothing's happening. No one's productive. Nothing's going right. And so can I monitor productivity? And the answer is yes. For valid business purposes, you can monitor productivity, and you can have people report in their time in terms of the hours logged. And I'll go back to what I said earlier. I'd rather you manage the outcomes than manage the time. They're going to get paid for the time that they work. Really, what you should be monitoring is the outcome of what you're expecting in terms of performance. And that would be a better way to sort of deal with employees that are potentially underperforming or taking advantage of being at home. I get employers coming to me saying, well, I'd love to deduct hours. I don't think they worked this 1 hour. I sent them a Teams. I could see it was unopened. An hour went by. I'm docking 45 minutes, or an hour to their pay because they were non-responsive. They're not working. Super dangerous path to go down. I'd be advising against that because you would have to investigate why they didn't respond. It could be that they were on a phone call. It could be that they were doing other work. It could be that they had their head down writing a brief. It could be a lot of different things. And so this sort of conclusion that employers are jumping to that people aren't being productive and therefore they want to monitor, the monitoring's okay, but the deduction of the hours I would be against. And you also have people with other considerations for kids that are at home, or people are, a lot of times, kids are sent home during COVID because there's a pod that needs to be at home for a week. I mean, there's a lot of other considerations to be pretty aware of. I said I'd touch on favoritism. I'm very mindful of our time, and I know we want to get a couple questions in as well. The issue with favoritism from a legal perspective involves discrimination. The issues that could arise, I gave the example of someone who says, hey, my manager seems to be coming into the office. Everyone's coming in. I'm going to stay home. And it happens to be that I'm female and I'm a mother and I'm picking up my kids from school. That could give rise to gender-based discrimination claims. And so all work from home policies have to be done on a non-discriminatory basis, and need to be applied evenly in that regard so that we're not having, being applied in a non-discriminatory manner. So we're not having those issues. A question was sort of, can you have different pockets of people, some working at home, some not? Absolutely. As long as it's not based on discriminatory lines or has a discriminatory impact, right? It's what we've always talked about in terms of discrimination. It's both impact and intent. You may not intend to discriminate, but the impact overall to a protected class is being impacted, and therefore you could have a potential discrimination. So the idea that you have a pocket of employees, let's say, that are support services, they may need to be on site 5 days a week, and that's okay. And you can have that, and you can have another pocket of employees that are working from home or on a hybrid schedule. Just make sure that it's not done in a discriminatory fashion. I am going to actually turn it over to Josh to make sure we can cover a couple of the questions in the final minutes that we have.
Thanks, Dana. I think this has been a really fascinating conversation, and in particular this last part that I think that came in as one of our audience questions through the registration. The idea of favoritism. Can certain employees or groups of employees or departments of employees work from home while others don't? I think one thing that you said for all of the managers out there, and I think it's really important, is intention isn't enough as it relates to discrimination. It's not enough that it wasn't intentional. It still has to ultimately prove not to be discriminatory in nature. And I think that's really helpful for us all to hear. We have a couple questions. For those of you who do need to leave at the top of the hour, we understand. We might go a few minutes past. For those of you who want to hear some of these audience questions that came in, I think they're great. And so I'd like to address a couple of them. The first one that came in, it's a little long, so hear me out. It says, are there other areas of liability that employers should be thinking about with employees working from home, such as sexual harassment, privacy on Zoom? You did cover this a little bit, the workers' compensation issues, when you talked about ergonomics and setups and things like that. But maybe on the first side, first two parts, sexual harassment, privacy. What are your thoughts there, Dana or Lara? Do you want to hop in there?
Yeah, Josh, I'll take this one. Look, the laws apply because the work at home is an extension of your regular office or business space. So all of that is in play, and all of that is something to be mindful of. And again, we're probably dealing with, because people are at home, this notion of being more relaxed in the way that potentially people communicate, the way people show up in terms of being on a Zoom. So sexual harassment, in terms of, there's much more frequent communication being done by way of Zoom meetings. There's more teams, being mindful of how you communicate on those devices and through those mediums is going to be vital, because everything regarding sexual harassment that we see in a traditional workspace would be equally applicable at home. Certainly. In terms of privacy considerations on Zoom, again, you're going to have a policy that's set up probably within a handbook that talks about really no expectation of privacy through, the communication of whether it be Teams or email or some sort of Slack, whatever you communicate. And so that still holds as well. And so the idea that somehow privacy's out the window, sexual harassment's out the window, we don't need to worry about those things because I'm at home, would be a mistake. So I wouldn't want to see that. And you did mention before, and we talked about it a little bit, was the workers' comp. Certainly, again, a logical extension of the workplace is your home, in which case the workers' comp claims could stem from an event that occurs at home. So that's certainly real.
And Dana, let me maybe add on to that question a little bit, because somebody else in our Q&A feature here asked a question of the similar grounds. And I don't know if this is a labor and employment, a cybersecurity, or even a risk management question. So you may not be able to answer it, but how is liability for privacy breaches managed through work from home? Is that something you can cover? I thought I'd ask since somebody added that on.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm understanding the question correctly, and obviously it's sort of a one-sided communication, but in terms of liability, a company is going to have the liability they would otherwise have in the standard workplace, right? So there's got to be protections that the employer puts in place to prevent exposure. So we'll take a law firm setting. We have to have controls in place to prevent, maintain attorney-client privilege, right? That we can't do away with just because we have a at-home environment. And in the same respect, with respect to potential privacy, cyber breaches, data privacy breaches, that's all in play. What it requires is a really robust process and technology implementation by the company, because you're dealing now with so many new environments being at home to protect against all the things that you could otherwise have normally controlled in one environment. You now have dozens of environments that you're controlling. So again, it's the communication at the outset with your employees, the expectations, and then you've got to actually put those controls in place through IT.
Yeah, I actually had that similar conversation with a risk manager a couple of weeks ago, and I got a similar response. All right, we've got another question. I'm gonna frame it a little bit to put some context around it. So we know, we've heard in the workforce that a lot of employees are dealing with positions where employees have a strong ability to negotiate terms of employment right now. A lot of them want to work from home. Some people, as we know, are predicting a recession. There might be a forecast of that, and that could shift the dynamics between employees and employers. So the question tied to all this is, how might an economic downturn impact retention and then work from home issues?
Yeah, I'll take that one. I mean, I think to the extent, employers start to retain some more bargaining power with respect to how they want their offices to function. I think with respect to some of those issues we're talking about, positions where, they're not particularly suited for work from home or hybrid environments, but we're seeing out of a need for retention that companies are, trying to adopt them or sort of struggling and working to adopt those things. I do see a shift with respect to positions like that. I think on the broader scale, though, I do think, as Dana started out, it is not COVID specific. And I think what we're seeing are a lot of companies are giving up, significant portions of their leases. They are reworking their workspaces. And so I do think there is an intentional focus on not just employee retention, but workplace culture and all of the things that we talked about in terms of the positives with respect to the hybrid model. And I think those positives are not just employee centric. There's a lot of positives and benefits to the employers as well. And so I don't see it just going away because we have a recession. Hopefully we don't, but to the extent the environment changes, I don't see some wholesale return back to the way things were. I think we're much beyond that. But I do see, in terms of bargaining power, some ability to pull back on some of the changes that aren't really working out, that are being done specifically for retention purposes.
Yeah, I think those are all fair things for us to consider. And of course, knock on wood, no recession coming forward. Two more questions. Let's see if we can get to them both. The question is, with the number of COVID-19 cases dropping, even though we are seeing that on the increase again, some employers are relaxing what used to be their one-time vaccine mandates. However, some of these same employers have not necessarily hired back or offered jobs to those who were previously terminated for their failure to be vaccinated. What do employers do in this situation?
Thanks, Josh. I'll grab this one. So when we were giving advice and we were hearing back from our clients during COVID, there was a tendency for people to say, hey, I'd love to use this as an opportunity to clean house. And they were just being honest in terms of employers that there's certain people that they could offload as part of the pandemic and the changes within the workplace. And one of the reasons or ways they did this is that if they knew that there were people that were not going to get vaccinated, they implemented mandatory vaccinations and then told the people they can no longer work there. As the numbers had been dropping, we have employers who've now switched that and said, hey, we're going to relax that. We're not going to require mandatory vaccination, but they haven't gone to the place of actually having these people return to work or offered their job back. Similar to when we deal with a layoff and the employer fails to contact the laid off employee and offer their job back or offer them at least the ability to reapply for the job. So it's just another potential issue that's swirling around that would be relatively new that we have to deal with, because there's employers that were taking advantage of the situation at the time and aren't being mindful of what their obligations might be now in terms of rehiring those people. And they're largely trying to turn a blind eye to it, but there's exposure for it for certain.
Yeah, I think there have definitely been discussions over the last couple of years about, this having been seen or maybe misperceived by some as an opportunity for companies to do some internal cleanup, whether or not it was actually COVID related or not. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. So our last question is a kind of a combination from a few people in the Q&A box. So basically, as employees, some are even required, depending on what company you're at, to work from home. Others, it's optional, as they're looking to seek some type of reimbursement. We've had a couple of questions about what types of things are reimbursable, what types of things are companies and employers obligated to pay for, such as, internet, if somebody's at home, office space, is there a percentage of their home that's dedicated to working that is now expensable somehow? Most people in those situations are not able to write those off on their taxes. So I'd be curious to know what the response is. And then I guess I'm just going to add the final twist. Is there a difference between obligation from an employer standpoint for people who choose to work from home versus people who are required to work from home? What are your thoughts there? I know there's a lot there to process.
Yeah, I'll try and jump in here. I think we covered some of the, the internet and the phone, so I won't spend time on that. But, I think there are frankly a lot of novel issues that are coming out of COVID, and it will be interesting from a legal perspective to see how some of that plays out in the courts and through the administrative processes. But, I would say that it certainly matters whether someone's working from home sort of voluntarily or if that's the setup. Because if they have the ability to come into the workplace and everything's available to them and they choose not to, I think from a legal perspective, that is a little different than, an employer physically not having a space and they're required to work from home and they're required to use all of those things and have the full office setup. I think that lends itself towards more exposure in terms of, reimbursement than when there are options available. So, in the latter instance, the employer is actually providing a number of those things. So, yeah, I mean, I think the office space is an interesting one. I think it's, in terms of a tax question, I certainly would leave it to the tax experts. We have not been, that certainly hasn't played out. I would anticipate that the expense is large enough that folks will probably wait for that to play out before just offering to pay that up. But certainly things like internet, cell phone use have been addressed previously, even though there's very, very limited law on it. And I think it would certainly, to the extent, there are employers out there who are not reimbursing those costs, I certainly would encourage, a closer look at that, because I think we do know there's certainly exposure there. And in light of, some of the other overhead expenses that can be saved on, I think that's a pretty limited expenditure, given the totality of the circumstances here.
And Josh, I'll just go a little bit further on it. The idea that potentially the employer could be on the hook for the rentable space sort of can be extended almost illogically. Does that mean then that the employer's on the hook for your water bill because you had to get water from your home during the time that you were at home? Does that mean that they're on the hook for electricity? Does that mean I should pay a portion of your property tax? I'll say this, I don't put it past anyone filing that complaint. I'm not sure I would take it. I have a feeling we'll be defending it. So I guess we'll wait and see.
Yeah, I have a feeling in the next couple of years, if not sooner, we're going to see a lot of new case law that is going to ultimately impact the way businesses operate and the way they handle this. And, candidly, the more exposure for businesses that's out there, I think the less likely you're going to see businesses being willing to offer as much flexibility from home. So that's one way to look at it. How about everyone, please join me, those of you who've remained, and really appreciate such a great conversation. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Laura. Absolutely outstanding. Thank you again to the firm, Michelman and Robinson. I think this was an important conversation that is beneficial to what I refer to as our community of business. I think it's important that we help to understand, how to navigate this new flexible hybrid workplace. And I think you guys did it in a way that was particularly helpful from both the management's point of view and then offering insights from the employee's point of view as well. So thank you for the consideration all around. I want to remind those of you that we'll have a recap of this in Monday's edition of the Business Journal. And it's also being recorded. So the entire 70 minutes here is going to be available on labusinessjournal.com beginning tomorrow. I'm sure there's a lot of people who have friends, colleagues, clients that would benefit from this information, and we hope that you share it. Thank you all again so much. It's been a pleasure hosting, and we look forward to our next talk. Be safe.